The phone rang at 6:47 a.m., cutting through the Texas dawn like a blade. Jake Morrison's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the receiver, his 65-year-old heart already knowing this wasn't good news. "Jake, you better get down here fast," came the voice of his neighbor, Tom Bradley. "That big bull of yours, something's got him and his mate real bad. Looks like a damn snake. Biggest I ever seen. The cow's bleeding out. And your bull, well, he ain't leaving her side." Jake's blood ran cold. Belle, his sweet Belle, heavy with her first calf. "Lord helps those who help themselves," Jake whispered, echoing his late wife Sarah's favorite saying. "But sometimes he sends angels with 4 legs." He grabbed his keys and raced toward his truck. But nothing could have prepared him for what he'd find at the South Pasture Titan, his massive Brahman bull, standing guard over Belle as she lay motionless, a python thick as a fence post still coiled around her swollen belly. What happened next would make a grown man weep. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 30 minutes earlier, the morning had started like any other at Triple Creek Ranch. The Texas sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in shades of gold and amber, and Belle had been grazing peacefully near the old oak tree where she and Titan spent most of their days. Jake had watched them from his kitchen window while sipping his first cup of coffee, the same ritual he'd followed since Sarah passed 2 years ago. Titan, all 2,000 pounds of him, had been doing what he always did, standing between Belle and any potential danger, even if that danger was just a butterfly or a curious barn cat. The massive Brahman bull never let her eat alone, always positioning himself where he could see the entire pasture. It was a sight that never failed to warm Jake's heart, reminding him of how he used to watch over Sarah the same way. Belle had been moving slower these past few weeks, her belly round with their first calf. The local veterinarian, Dr. Emily Chen, had estimated she was about 8 months along, maybe more. Jake had been checking on her twice a day, making sure she had fresh water and the best grass. This pregnancy meant everything to him, new life on a ranch that had seen too much death lately. Then everything changed in the span of heartbeats. The python had come from nowhere, an 18-foot monster that had no business being in Texas. It struck with the speed of lightning, coiling around Belle before she could even cry out. The attack was silent, deadly, and completely unexpected. Belle's legs had buckled under the crushing weight, her brown eyes wide with terror and pain. But Titan Lord. What Titan did next defied every instinct Jake thought he knew about cattle. Instead of running, instead of following his herd instincts to flee from danger, the bull had charged. Not away from the threat, but straight into it. Jake had never seen anything like it in all his years raising livestock. The battle was fierce and desperate. Titan used his massive head and shoulders to try to break the python's grip, his hooves striking the ground with the force of sledgehammers. The snake had fought back, its coils tightening around Belle while trying to strike at Titan. Blood had begun to pool in the grass, some from Belle's wounds where the python's teeth had found purchase, some from the gashes the massive snake had torn in Titan's hide. When Tom Bradley's frantic call had finally come through, Belle was unconscious and bleeding. The python finally driven off, but not before doing its damage. And Titan brave, loyal Titan stood over her like a sentinel, his sides heaving, his eyes never leaving her face. Now Jake had less than 30 minutes to save them both, and something deep in his gut told him this was no random act of nature. Pythons didn't just appear in Texas. Someone had brought this hell to his doorstep. 3 years ago, Jake Morrison had been a different man. The Vietnam War had left its marks on him, not just the shrapnel scar that ran down his left arm, but the deeper wounds that never quite healed. When Sarah was alive, she'd been his anchor, the reason he could sleep through the night without waking up in cold sweats. But cancer had taken her, slow and cruel, and Jake had found himself alone on 300 acres of Texas ranch land with nothing but memories and regrets for company. That's when Titan and Belle had come into his life, though come wasn't quite the right word, more like crashed into it, the way most of God's blessings seem to arrive unexpected and wrapped in trouble. Jake had been driving home from Sarah's funeral when he'd spotted the livestock trailer overturned on Highway 35. The driver, some young kid hauling cattle for a slaughterhouse downstate, had taken the curve too fast and lost control. Most of the cattle had been killed on impact. But Jake had heard something that made him pull over the desperate lowing of survivors. 2 calves, barely weaned, had somehow made it through the wreck. The bull calf was already showing the distinctive hump and loose skin of a Brahman, his dark eyes wild with terror and confusion. The heifer was smaller, more delicate, with a coat the color of honey and the gentlest disposition Jake had ever seen in cattle. Both were injured, both were orphaned, and both would have been put down if Jake hadn't made a decision that his neighbors would question for months to come. Sarah always said every creature deserves a second chance. He'd told the state trooper who'd responded to the accident, "I'll take them." The trooper had looked at Jake like he'd lost his mind. "Sir, that bull calf's gonna grow up to be 2,000 pounds of mean. Brahmins aren't pets, especially not the males. They're bred for size and temperament, and not the gentle kind." But Jake had already made up his mind. Something about the way the little bull had positioned himself between his sister and the world, even at just a few months old, reminded Jake of himself, of the young soldier who'd learned to protect what mattered, no matter the cost. Bringing them home had been the easy part. Convincing his neighbors and himself that he wasn't crazy had been another matter entirely. Marcus Webb, whose property bordered Jake's to the north, had been the most vocal opponent. Marcus was another Vietnam vet, someone Jake had served with in the Central Highlands, someone who'd once been closer than a brother. But time and bitterness had changed Marcus, turned him into the kind of man who saw dollar signs where others saw God's creation. "You're making a mistake, Jake," Marcus had said, standing in Jake's kitchen just a week after the calves arrived. "That bull's gonna turn mean, and when he does, he's gonna hurt someone. Then you'll have lawsuits, insurance claims, maybe worse. Sell them now while they're still manageable." Jake had refused, and that refusal had been the beginning of the end of their friendship. Marcus had made his position clear. The bulls were dangerous. The ranch was too close to residential areas, and Jake was being irresponsible. When Jake wouldn't budge, Marcus had started making calls to the county, to animal control, to anyone who would listen. But Jake had held firm, and Sarah's memory had given him strength. She used to say that love changes a wild heart. He'd told Dr. Chen during one of her first visits to check on the growing calves. Said it worked on me, might work on them too. And it had worked. in ways that defied everything Jake thought he knew about cattle behavior. Titan had grown into exactly the kind of massive, potentially dangerous bull that Marcus had predicted, except he wasn't dangerous, not to the things he loved. He was protective, intelligent, and loyal in ways that reminded Jake more of a faithful dog than livestock. Belle had grown too, into a beautiful, gentle cow who seemed to understand that she was loved rather than merely owned. She would come when Jake called her name, would let him check her hooves and brush her coat without a halter or rope. But more than that, she had gentled Titan in ways that no amount of human intervention could have achieved. The bull who might have become aggressive and territorial instead became Belle's devoted guardian. Jake had watched them grow together, had seen Titan learn to moderate his strength around her, to share the best grass, to position himself between her and anything that might represent a threat. It was a love story written in the language of the pasture, and it had given Jake something to believe in during the darkest period of his life. "They're teaching us something," Sarah had said during her last summer, when she was still strong enough to sit on the porch and watch them graze. About what it means to love without conditions, to protect without expecting anything in return. She'd been right, as she usually was. Watching Titan and Belle had helped Jake understand his own grief, his own need to protect the things that mattered. When Sarah died, Jake had half expected to lose interest in the ranch, in the cattle, in everything. Instead, caring for them had become his way of honoring her memory. The community had eventually come around. Once they saw that Titan wasn't the menace Marcus had predicted. Children from town would sometimes come by with their parents to see the gentle giant and his mate. Jake had even started giving informal tours, sharing what he'd learned about the intelligence and emotional capacity of cattle. But Marcus had never forgiven what he saw as Jake's stubborn refusal to listen to reason. The relationship between the two former friends had grown colder each year, marked by property disputes, complaints to the county, and a general hostility that saddened Jake more than he cared to admit. "Some people never learn that love is stronger than fear," Sarah had said during one of their last conversations. "Marcus is one of those people. He sees danger where you see blessing." Now, racing toward the south pasture with his heart hammering in his chest, Jake wondered if Sarah had been wrong about that. Maybe Marcus had been right all along. Maybe keeping 2,000-pound animals was irresponsible, dangerous, a recipe for exactly the kind of disaster that was unfolding right now. But then Jake thought about the way Titan had stood over Belle's injured form, refusing to abandon her even when his own life might be in danger. He thought about the intelligence in the bull's dark eyes, the gentleness in his massive frame, the love that had grown between two creatures who had every reason to remain wild and separate. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," Jake whispered, quoting the verse Sarah had insisted on including in their wedding vows 43 years ago. It seemed appropriate now, racing to save two animals whose bond had taught him more about devotion than most humans ever managed to demonstrate. Whatever was happening at the south pasture, whatever danger had invaded his peaceful ranch, Jake knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let them face it alone. Titan and Belle had given him purpose when he needed it most, had shown him that love could survive loss, that protection was a choice you made every day. Now it was his turn to prove that loyalty ran both ways, that the bonds formed in love were stronger than anything that threatened to break them apart. Jake's truck kicked up a cloud of dust as he skidded to a stop near the south pasture fence. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat like a fishhook. Belle lay motionless on her side, her honey-colored coat stained dark with blood, while Titan stood over her like a mountain of muscle and determination. The python was gone, but its work was done. Deep puncture wounds dotted Belle's neck and shoulders, and her breathing was so shallow, Jake had to strain to see her chest rise and fall. Dr. Emily Chen's Honda Civic was already there, the young veterinarian kneeling beside Belle with her medical bag spread open in the grass. Emily had been making emergency calls for 15 years. But Jake could see the worry etched deep in her expression as she worked. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, cleaning wounds. But her furrowed brow told a story Jake didn't want to hear. "How bad is it?" Jake asked, his voice rougher than he intended. He kept one eye on Titan, who hadn't moved from his protective stance but was watching every movement with the intensity of a sentry. Emily looked up, her dark eyes grave. "Jake, I need to tell you something. Belle isn't just injured." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's pregnant, very pregnant. 8 months, maybe more, and the stress from this attack." She trailed off, returning to her examination. Jake felt the world tilt under his feet. Pregnant. He'd suspected, had seen Belle moving more carefully lately, eating for what he'd assumed was just winter weight. But 8 months pregnant meant the baby, he whispered. "The calf is in distress," Emily confirmed, her stethoscope pressed against Belle's swollen belly. "Heart rate is dropping, and Belle, she's lost a lot of blood. I'm going to be honest with you. Jake, I don't know if I can save them both." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been through this before, 37 years ago when Sarah had been pregnant with their only child. The complications, the impossible choices, the heartbreak that had taken them years to overcome. They'd tried again after that, but Sarah had never been able to carry another pregnancy to term. Now, standing in this blood-stained pasture, Jake felt those old wounds tear open fresh and raw. Titan seemed to understand the gravity of the situation in ways that defied explanation. The massive bull, who could have easily trampled any human who came too close, carefully stepped aside to give Emily room to work. But he didn't go far, just far enough to let her access Belle while keeping himself between them and any potential threat. Then Titan did something that made Jake's throat close up with emotion. The bull lowered his enormous head and gently placed it against Belle's swollen belly, as if he were listening for the heartbeat of their unborn calf. His dark eyes found Jake's across the space between them, and in that moment, Jake heard a message as clear as if Titan had spoken, "Save our child." "My God," Emily breathed, watching the interaction. "I've never seen anything like this." Jake knelt beside her, his arthritic knees protesting against the hard ground. Up close, he could see just how bad Belle's injuries really were. The python's teeth had left deep punctures in her neck and shoulder, and one particularly nasty wound was still bleeding despite Emily's efforts to staunch it. But it was Belle's labored breathing that worried Jake most, the sound of someone fighting just to draw their next breath. "What do you need me to do?" Jake asked. Emily was already preparing a syringe, her movements quick and precise. "I need to get her stabilized first. Then we need to make some decisions. Fast. If I focus on saving Belle, we might lose the calf. If I try to deliver the calf now, Belle might not survive the procedure. And there's something else." She pointed to what Jake had initially missed in his panic: the python's shed skin caught on a nearby fence post, and strange marks in the dirt that looked almost like tire tracks. But more disturbing were the clean cuts on the snake's discarded skin, edges too precise to be natural. "Jake, this python didn't just wander onto your property. Someone brought it here. Look at these marks. This snake was kept in captivity, fed regularly, handled by humans. And these cuts." She held up a section of the shed skin. "These look like they were made by some kind of blade or cutting tool. Someone modified this snake. Maybe tried to make it more aggressive." Jake's blood ran cold. He thought about Marcus's warnings, about the escalating property disputes, about the complaints to the county that had grown more frequent over the past year. But even Marcus wouldn't go this far. Would he? Who would do something like this? Jake asked, though deep in his gut, he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Before Emily could respond, Titan suddenly raised his head. His ears pricked forward in the way that meant he'd detected something Jake's human senses had missed. The bull's entire body tensed, and he positioned himself more squarely between Belle and whatever he'd sensed approaching. That's when Jake heard it, the distant rumble of a diesel engine coming up the ranch road. Not the sound of someone coming to help, but the deliberate approach of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. "We need to move her," Emily said urgently, following Jake's gaze toward the approaching sound. "I can't do what needs to be done out here in the open. And if someone's coming who might have been responsible for this—" She didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to. Jake looked at Titan, then at Belle's still form, then back at the bull who had become more family than livestock. Can she be moved? It's risky. But staying here might be riskier. If we can get her to the barn, I've got better equipment in my truck, better lighting, cleaner conditions. But Jake... Emily's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You need to understand, even if we do everything right, even if we move fast, there's a good chance we're going to lose one of them. Maybe both." The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, and Jake made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. "Titan," he said, using the same tone he'd used to train the bull as a calf. "We need to help Belle. Can you help us move her?" What happened next would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand the bond between the three of them. Titan carefully positioned himself beside Belle's prone form and, using his massive strength with incredible gentleness, began to help lift her onto the makeshift stretcher Emily had fashioned from her emergency supplies. As they worked together, human, bull, and dying cow, to get Belle loaded for transport to the barn, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time in more ways than one. The engine sound was getting closer, and something told him that whoever was coming wasn't bringing help. They had minutes, maybe less, before everything changed again. And somewhere, in the growing darkness of Belle's condition and the approaching unknown, Jake realized that the peaceful life he'd built on this ranch was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The only question now was whether love and loyalty would be enough to see them through what was coming. The diesel engine belonged to a familiar red pickup truck, one that made Jake's stomach drop like a stone in deep water. Marcus Webb's Ford F-250 came to a stop just outside the pasture gate, and Jake watched his former friend climb out with the deliberate movements of a man who had come here with a purpose. Marcus looked older than his 67 years. His face weathered by decades of Texas sun and whatever bitterness had been eating at him since Vietnam. He wore his usual work clothes, faded jeans, boots that had seen better days, and a shirt that hung loose on his increasingly thin frame. But it was what he carried in his hands that made Jake's blood turn to ice water. A leather case, the kind used to transport reptiles. "Marcus," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. "What brings you by this morning?" Marcus approached slowly, his eyes taking in the seen Belle on the improvised stretcher. Emily's medical supplies scattered in the grass, Titan standing guard with his massive frame tense and ready. When Marcus smiled, it wasn't the expression of a man who'd come to help. "Heard you had some trouble with a snake," Marcus said, setting the case down carefully. "Thought I might be able to shed some light on that situation." Dr. Chen looked up from where she was checking Belle's IV line. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but we have a medical emergency here. This cow is in critical condition, and I know exactly what condition she's in." Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of cold certainty that made Jake's hands clench into fists. "See, I know all about that snake. Been taking real good care of it for the better part of 6 months now." The confession hung in the morning air like smoke from a house fire. Jake felt 37 years of friendship crumble into dust, replaced by a rage so pure it made his vision blur around the edges. "You son of a bitch," Jake breathed. "You did this." Marcus's laugh was devoid of any warmth. "I tried to warn you. Jake, told you those animals were dangerous, told you someone was going to get hurt. But you wouldn't listen. You never did listen. Not in Nam. Not after we got home. Not when it mattered." Emily had gone very still, her hands hovering over Belle's prone form. Titan sensed the change in atmosphere, his massive head swinging toward Marcus with an intensity that would have made a smart man step back. Marcus either wasn't smart, or he was too committed to his course to care about the danger. "Why?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew. This was about more than cattle, more than property lines or county complaints. This was about something that had been festering between them for decades. "Because you left me behind," Marcus said, his voice rising. "Khe-Sanh, 1968. You remember that, Jake, when the mortars started falling and you could have come back for me. But you didn't. You saved yourself and let me crawl out with shrapnel in my back and a piece of metal that's been reminding me every day for 55 years what kind of friend you really are." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. Khe-Sanh. He remembered it all too well, the chaos, the explosions, the impossible decisions that young soldiers had to make in the space between heartbeats. He remembered Marcus going down, remembered the order to fall back, remembered the agonizing choice between following orders and trying to save one man. "Marcus, that's not how it happened," Jake said, his voice heavy with old pain. "The lieutenant ordered us to fall back. I wanted to come for you, but you followed orders instead of following your heart," Marcus finished. "Just like you always did. Just like you did when I needed you most." Emily was looking between them with growing alarm, clearly understanding that this confrontation was about much more than a snake attack. She continued working on Belle, but Jake could see her positioning herself to shield her patient if things went bad. "So this is your revenge?" Jake asked. 55 years later, you decide to get even by killing innocent animals. Marcus opened the leather case, revealing coiled ropes and what looked like snake-handling equipment. "I've been planning this for a long time. Jake, got that python from a guy down in Louisiana who breeds them for private collectors. 20 feet long. Aggressive as hell when you know how to make it that way. Figured if your precious cattle got hurt, maybe killed, you'd finally understand what it feels like to lose something that matters." The casual cruelty of it took Jake's breath away. This wasn't just about Vietnam. Wasn't just about old wounds that had never healed. This was about a man who had let bitterness poison every good thing in his life until there was nothing left but the need to make others suffer. "But here's the thing I didn't count on," Marcus continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "That bull of yours fighting back wasn't supposed to happen that way. Snake should have killed them both, quick and clean. Instead, you got yourself a whole drama, got the vet involved, got witnesses. Titan had heard enough." The massive bull took a step forward, his 1,000-pound frame moving with surprising grace. His dark eyes were fixed on Marcus with the kind of focus that prey animals recognized as a death warrant. "Easy, boy," Jake said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Titan or to himself. "Easy." But Marcus wasn't done. He pulled something else from his truck, a hunting rifle, the kind used for taking down large game. "See? Now I got a problem. Too many people know too much. That pretty little vet there, she's already figured out the snake was modified. And you, Jake, you always were too smart for your own good." Emily's face had gone pale, but her hands never stopped moving as she worked to stabilize Belle. "Mister, I don't know what this is about, but I'm trying to save a life here. A mother and her unborn calf. Whatever happened between you two, it doesn't have to involve them." "Oh, but it does," Marcus said, raising the rifle. "You see, this isn't just about getting even anymore. This is about cleaning up loose ends, about making sure the story ends the way it's supposed to." Jake felt the world narrow down to this moment, this choice. Just like Kaysan, just like every other moment in his life when he'd had to decide between safety and doing what was right. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't a scared kid following orders. This time, he was a man protecting his family. "Marcus, please," Jake said, taking a step forward. "You want to hurt me? Fine. I'm right here, but leave them out of it. They never did anything to you." Marcus's finger moved to the trigger, and in that instant, Jake saw the end of everything he'd tried to build since Sarah's death. The peaceful ranch, the gentle giants who'd taught him about love without conditions, the quiet life he'd carved out of grief and hope. But then something happened that none of them expected. Belle, who had been unconscious for the past 20 minutes, suddenly let out a low, pained sound. Not the sound of death, but the sound of life fighting to be born. "The calf," Emily said urgently. "She's going into labor. Right now." And in that moment, as new life insisted on making its entrance into a world full of old hatred and fresh violence, everything changed. Even Marcus lowered his rifle slightly, struck by the fundamental power of birth occurring in the midst of their human drama. Titan turned his attention back to Bell, his protective instincts overriding even the threat Marcus represented, and Jake realized that whatever happened next, whatever choices had to be made, there were now 4 lives at stake instead of 3. The morning that had started with such promise had become a battlefield where the past and future collided, where love and hatred fought for supremacy, and where the outcome would determine not just who lived or died, but what kind of man Jake Morrison really was when everything he cherished hung in the balance. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a fever dream, moments of desperate hope crashing against waves of mounting terror. In the present, Dr. Chen worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Her hands moved inside Belle's birth canal, trying to guide the calf into position while monitoring the mother's rapidly weakening pulse. "The calf is breached," Emily announced, her voice tight with concentration. "I need to turn it, but Belle's so weak." She looked up at Jake, her face streaked with sweat and blood. "I don't know if she has the strength left to push." Meanwhile, Marcus kept his rifle trained on the group, but Jake could see uncertainty creeping into his former friend's eyes. Whatever Marcus had planned, it hadn't included watching new life struggle to enter the world. The old soldier's hands shook slightly as he held the weapon, and Jake recognized the internal battle he'd seen in too many veterans, the war between the man they'd been and the man the war had made them. In Jake's memory, he was back in their kitchen 3 years ago, watching Sarah argue with him about keeping the orphaned calves. She'd been in remission then, her color good, her spirits high. They'd been sitting at the same scarred oak table where they'd shared 40 years of meals, dreams, and disappointments. "You can't save every broken thing that comes your way, Jake Morrison," she'd said, but her eyes had been smiling. "Lord knows you've been trying to save me for 2 years now." "These calves are different," Jake had insisted, though he couldn't quite explain why. "There's something about the way that little bull protects his sister. Reminds me of something." Sarah had reached across the table and taken his weathered hand in her still strong fingers. "Reminds you of yourself? You mean the way you tried to protect everyone in your unit, the way you've been trying to protect me." She'd squeezed his hand gently. "Some things can't be protected. Love. But some things can be loved. There's a difference." Back in the present, Titan was demonstrating exactly what Sarah had meant. The massive bull couldn't protect Belle from the internal struggle she was fighting, couldn't ease the pain of difficult labor or replace the blood she'd lost, but he could love her. He positioned himself where she could see him, where his presence could comfort her, and he made soft, encouraging sounds that seemed to give her strength. Emily's voice cut through Jake's reverie. "She's pushing. I can see the calf's hooves, but—" Her expression darkened. "There's no movement. The calf isn't responding." Jake's heart clenched. This was Vietnam all over again. Sarah's miscarriage all over again. Every moment in his life when love hadn't been enough to prevent loss. He remembered holding Sarah in the hospital bed 37 years ago. Both of them crying for the child they'd never get to meet. Both of them wondering if they'd done something wrong, if they could have tried harder, loved better. "Sometimes love means letting go," Sarah had whispered then, echoing words she'd repeat during her final battle with cancer. Sometimes the greatest love is accepting what you can't control. But Jake had never been good at letting go. In Nam, he'd tried to save everyone in his squad, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always carrying the weight of both outcomes. With Sarah, he'd fought every step of her illness, researching treatments, driving her to appointments, refusing to acknowledge the inevitable until the very end. Now, watching Belle struggle to bring life into a world that had shown her only violence, Jake felt that familiar rage against the unfairness of it all. Good things died while evil endured. Innocent creatures suffered while the guilty walked free. Love wasn't enough, had never been enough, would never be enough. Marcus must have sensed his thoughts, because the older man's voice cut through the morning air with bitter satisfaction. Now, you're starting to understand, aren't you? Jake, this is what it feels like when the things you love are dying and there's nothing you can do about it. This is what I felt like crawling through that jungle with shrapnel in my back, wondering if my best friend was going to come back for me. I wanted to come back, Jake said, his voice breaking. You have to believe me. Marcus, I wanted to, but the lieutenant gave you an excuse to do what you wanted to do anyway. Marcus interrupted. Save yourself first, just like you always did. Emily looked up from her work, her face flushed with effort. I need you both to stop talking and help me. This calf is stuck, and Belle is fading fast. I need someone to support her head while I work, and I need someone else to... A gunshot cracked across the pasture, echoing off the barn walls and sending a flock of crows exploding from the nearby oak tree. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jake realized that Marcus had fired into the air. Not at anyone. Nobody moves, Marcus said, his voice steady again. This ends the way it needs to end. Jake learns what loss feels like. And then we're done. But Titan had other ideas. The gunshot had triggered something primal in the bull's protective instincts. With a bellow that shook the ground, he charged not at Marcus, but at the fence post where the python's shed skin still hung. His massive head struck the post with tremendous force, snapping it in half and sending the gruesome trophy flying into the grass. The display of raw power made Marcus take a step back, his rifle wavering. Jesus Christ, that thing's dangerous. You see, this is exactly what I was trying to tell you. He's not dangerous, Jake said, understanding flooding through him. He's desperate, just like you, just like me. Emily had managed to turn the calf, and now she was working to clear its airway. I've got a heartbeat, she called out. Weak, but steady. Belle, come on, girl. One more push. In his memory, Jake was back in the hospital room where Sarah had spent her final weeks. The machines had been beeping steadily, marking time in a life that was slowly ebbing away. She'd been sleeping most of the day, her hand still clasped in his, her breathing shallow but peaceful. You know what I regret most, she'd whispered during one of her lucid moments. What's that, honey? That we never got to see our babies grow up, never got to be grandparents, never got to leave something of ourselves behind. Jake had squeezed her hand, his throat too tight for words. They'd tried for years after the first loss, but Sarah's body had never been able to carry another pregnancy to term. It had been a private grief, one they'd shared only with each other, one that had made them appreciate the life they had, while never quite filling the hole where their children should have been. "Maybe that's why you love those cattle so much," Sarah had continued. "They're the children we never had, the family we never got to raise." Back in the present, Belle gave one final, tremendous push, and Emily pulled the calf free. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nothing happened. The calf lay motionless in Emily's hands, its coat dark with birth fluids, its tiny chest still. Then Emily cleared its airways and began rubbing its chest vigorously. "Come on, baby. Come on." Marcus lowered his rifle slightly, caught up despite himself in the drama of new life. Even his hatred couldn't completely overcome the fundamental human response to birth, to the possibility of hope in the midst of despair. Titan moved closer to Belle, his massive head lowering to nuzzle her gently. She lifted her own head just enough to see her calf, and the sound she made was unlike anything Jake had ever heard from cattle, a soft, questioning moo that seemed to ask if her baby was going to be all right. And then, like a miracle punctuating a morning full of nightmares, the calf drew its first breath, a tiny, gasping sound that seemed to fill the entire pasture with possibility. "She's alive," Emily announced, her voice filled with wonder. "It's a little heifer, and she's breathing." For a moment, even Marcus seemed to forget why he'd come. The sight of new life, of a family reunited against all odds, touched something in him that years of bitterness hadn't quite managed to kill. But the moment didn't last. As Jake stepped forward to get a better look at the calf, Marcus raised his rifle again, remembering his purpose. "This doesn't change anything," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This doesn't make up for what you did." The newborn calf's first cry seemed to break something inside Marcus Webb. His hands trembled as he raised the rifle higher, and Jake could see the war playing out behind his old friend's eyes. 55 years of buried resentment fighting against the simple, undeniable beauty of new life taking its first breath. "This doesn't change what you did to me," Marcus repeated, but his voice cracked like a teenager's. "This doesn't bring back the years I lost, the pain I've carried, the life I could have had if you hadn't left me to die in that jungle." Jake took a careful step forward, his hands visible and empty. "Marcus, you didn't die. You made it home. We both did." "Did I?" Marcus's laugh was hollow, bitter as black coffee. "You think surviving is the same as living. You came home to Sarah, to this ranch, to a life that made sense. I came home to what? A trailer park, disability checks, and a back that screams at me every morning when I wake up alone." Chen continued working on the calf, cleaning its airways and checking its vital signs. But Jake could see her listening to every word. The newborn was breathing steadily now, and Belle was trying to lift her head to see her baby. Titan stood guard over both of them, his massive frame tense but patient. "You could have had a different life," Jake said quietly. "You chose this. You chose the anger." "I chose the anger." Marcus's voice rose to a shout. "You left me bleeding in the mud. You left me for dead, and came home a hero while I crawled out on my belly like a snake." The word snake hung in the air between them, and Jake finally understood the twisted logic that had led his former friend to this moment. The python hadn't been chosen randomly. It was symbolic. Marcus's way of making Jake understand what it felt like to be attacked by something that shouldn't exist in your world, something that struck without warning and left you helpless. "The snake," Jake said, pieces clicking together. "You trained it to be aggressive. Didn't you fed it? Conditioned it to attack cattle?" Marcus nodded, a sick pride creeping into his expression. "Took me 6 months. Got it from a breeder in Louisiana who didn't ask too many questions. 20 feet of pure hate. Just like what's been living in my chest since 1968. Emily looked up from the calf, her face pale with disgust. "You turned a living creature into a weapon. Made it suffer just to make other things suffer." "Everything suffers," Marcus said flatly. "The question is whether you suffer alone or make sure the people who hurt you suffer with you." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This wasn't just about Vietnam anymore. This was about a man who had let pain transform him into something unrecognizable. Someone who could look at a newborn calf and still feel nothing but the need for revenge. "What about Sarah?" Jake asked, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. "What about the accident?" Marcus's smile was the most horrifying thing Jake had ever seen. What accident would that be? Jake. The world tilted sideways. Sarah's car accident 2 years ago. The brake failure that had sent her into a ditch on the way home from her doctor's appointment. The mechanic had said it was a freak failure. Metal fatigue. One of those things that just happen to older vehicles. "You son of a bitch," Jake breathed. "You killed her." "I gave her the same chance you gave me," Marcus said, his voice now completely calm, matter of fact. "I cut her brake lines just enough to fail when she hit that curve on Miller Road. She had maybe 30 seconds to figure out what was happening, same as I had when those mortars started falling, and I realized my best friend wasn't coming back for me." Jake's vision went red around the edges. Sarah's death hadn't been an accident. The woman he'd loved for 43 years, the gentle soul who'd never hurt anyone, had died because of his choices in a war that ended before she'd even met him. The grief he'd been carrying, the guilt about not being with her that day, the regret about things left unsaid, all of it had been orchestrated by someone he'd once trusted with his life. "She was innocent," Jake said, his voice barely human. "So was I," Marcus replied. 19 years old. Just wanted to serve my country and come home to marry my high school sweetheart. Instead, I came home broken, and she took one look at me in that wheelchair and decided she couldn't handle being married to half a man. Jake lunged forward, but Marcus swung the rifle toward him. We're not done yet. See, killing Sarah was just the beginning. I wanted you to feel what it was like to lose everything slowly, piece by piece. First your wife, then your precious cattle, then finally you." Emily had wrapped the calf in a blanket and was helping it get closer to Belle, but she was clearly listening to every word of Marcus's confession. The horror on her face reflected Jake's own feelings. They were dealing with someone who had moved far beyond rational thought into the realm of pure malice. "The county inspections," Jake said, understanding dawning. "The complaints about the bulls being dangerous. That was all you—" Every single one. I figured if I could get them declared a public menace, you'd be forced to sell them or put them down. But you fought every complaint, hired lawyers, made it into a crusade. So I decided to handle things more directly. Titan seemed to sense the escalating tension. The bull moved slightly, positioning himself so that his massive body shielded both Belle and the calf from Marcus's line of sight. It was a deliberate, intelligent action that made Emily gasp with surprise. "That bull understands what's happening," she whispered. "He knows there's danger here." Marcus noticed Titan's movement and laughed. "Oh, he understands all right. Animals know when they're about to die. They can smell it on the air. That's what I smelled in Vietnam. Jake, death coming for me while my best friend ran away to save his own skin. I followed orders," Jake said desperately. "The lieutenant said to fall back. If I'd disobeyed, you'd have been court-martialed, I know. You told yourself that story for 55 years, didn't you? That you had no choice? That you were just following orders? Well, guess what? I'm done listening to your excuses." Marcus raised the rifle, aiming it directly at Titan. "I'm going to kill your bull first, make you watch him die, then the cow, then the calf, and then you'll know exactly what it feels like to have everything you love ripped away while you stand there helpless." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the moment when all his choices, all his failures, all his attempts to build something good out of the ashes of war came down to this single confrontation in a Texas pasture. But as Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger, something unexpected happened. Belle, who had been lying quietly while Emily tended to the calf, suddenly struggled to her feet. She was weak, unstable, bleeding from multiple wounds, but maternal instinct drove her upright. She positioned herself between Marcus and her newborn calf, her gentle brown eyes now blazing with protective fire. "Jesus," Emily breathed. "She's trying to shield the baby." Titan moved immediately to support Belle, his massive shoulder taking some of her weight while keeping himself positioned as a secondary barrier between the threat and his family. The sight of the two injured animals, battered and bleeding but still fighting to protect their child, created a tableau that even Marcus couldn't ignore. "You see that?" Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what love looks like. That's what protecting your family actually means. Not revenge, not making others suffer. Standing between the people you care about and the things that want to hurt them." For a moment, Marcus wavered. Jake could see something flicker in his old friend's eyes, recognition, maybe even shame. The rifle barrel dropped slightly, but then Marcus's face hardened again. Pretty words. Jake. But love doesn't stop bullets. He raised the rifle one final time, and Jake knew with absolute certainty that talking was over. Whatever happened next would be decided by action, not words, in the space of a heartbeat. Jake had to choose between his own safety and the lives of the creatures who had become his family. Just like Vietnam, just like every other moment in his life when courage had been tested against fear. But this time, Jake Morrison didn't hesitate. This time, he didn't wait for orders or permission or someone else to make the hard choice. He threw himself forward directly into the path of Marcus's rifle, just as his former friend's finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the pasture like thunder, and Jake felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the grass. Pain exploded through his body, but he was alive, and more importantly, Titan and Belle and their newborn calf were unharmed. Marcus stared at him in shock. "You stupid bastard! You never did know when to quit." Jake struggled to his feet, blood streaming down his arm. "And you never knew when to let go." But the confrontation wasn't over. Marcus was already working the bolt action, preparing for another shot. And Jake knew his wounded shoulder wouldn't let him make another heroic leap. That's when Titan made his choice. With a bellow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, Titan charged. 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury launched across the pasture like a freight train, his massive hooves thundering against the hard-packed dirt. Marcus had just enough time to swing the rifle toward the charging bull before Titan's enormous head connected with his midsection, lifting the older man completely off his feet. The rifle spun through the air, its second shot firing harmlessly into the sky as Marcus crashed to the ground 15 feet away. He lay there gasping, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at Titan, who stood over him like a mountain of righteous anger. For a moment, Jake thought it was over. The threat was neutralized. Marcus was down, and his family was safe. But Marcus wasn't finished. As Titan turned back toward Belle and the calf, the bitter old soldier pulled something from his boot, a .38 snub-nose revolver, the kind of backup weapon that paranoid veterans sometimes carried. His face was twisted with pain and rage, but his hand was steady as he raised the pistol. "Titan!" Jake shouted, but the bull was already moving back toward his mate and newborn daughter, unaware of the danger behind him. The pistol cracked twice in rapid succession. The first bullet caught Titan in the hindquarter, sending the massive bull stumbling sideways. The second shot, aimed at his head, went wide as Marcus's injured ribs interfered with his aim. But even wounded, even bleeding, Titan didn't go down. Instead, he spun around to face this new threat, his dark eyes burning with an intelligence that transcended mere animal instinct. "No more," Jake said, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to echo across the pasture. He walked toward Marcus, his wounded shoulder screaming protest with every step, but his resolve absolute. "This ends now." Marcus swung the gun toward Jake, but his movements were slow, hampered by the damage Titan's charge had inflicted. Before he could fire, Jake was on him. The two old soldiers grappling in the dirt like they were teenagers again, fighting over some long-forgotten slight behind the barracks. But they weren't teenagers. They were two men in their 60s, both carrying injuries, both powered by decades of accumulated pain and rage. The fight was brutal and clumsy, all desperate strength and old reflexes failing against bodies that couldn't keep up with their memories of youth. Jake managed to get his good hand around Marcus's wrist, trying to control the gun. Marcus drove his knee into Jake's wounded shoulder, sending lightning bolts of agony through his entire body. They rolled in the grass, each trying to gain advantage, the .38 pointing first at the sky, then at the ground, then at each other. "You should have died in Vietnam," Marcus gasped, his breath hot against Jake's face. "Should have been you instead of me crawling through that jungle." "Maybe you're right," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "Maybe I should have died there, but I didn't, and neither did you. We both came home. Marcus, we both got a second chance at life." The gun went off again. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Marcus's grip on the pistol loosened, and his eyes went wide with shock. The bullet had ricocheted off a rock and caught him in the chest. just below the heart. Blood began to spread across his faded work shirt like spilled wine. "Well," Marcus said, his voice already getting weaker. "Guess that settles things." Jake pulled himself away, staring down at the man who had once been closer than a brother, who had shared foxholes and fears and dreams of home during the worst months of their young lives. Marcus was dying, and they both knew it. "I'm sorry," Jake said, and he meant it. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you in Vietnam. I'm sorry you came home broken. I'm sorry Sarah had to die for my mistakes." Marcus coughed, blood speckling his lips. "You know what the hell of it is. I loved her too. Not the way you did, but she was kind to me when I first got back. Before the pain made me mean. Before I let the anger eat up everything good in me." Jake felt tears running down his cheeks, mixing with the blood from his shoulder wound. "It didn't have to be this way." "Yeah, it did," Marcus whispered. "Some wounds don't heal, Jake. Some of us come home from war and never really make it back." Dr. Chen appeared beside them, her medical bag in hand. She knelt beside Marcus, checking his pulse, assessing his injuries with professional detachment, but Jake could see the futility in her eyes. The bullet had done too much damage, and Marcus was already fading. "Can you save him?" Jake asked. Emily shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry. The wound is too severe. He's lost too much blood." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't waste your medicine on me, Doc. Save it for something worth saving." He looked past her toward where Titan stood guard over Belle and the calf. "That bull of yours, he's something special. Takes guts to charge a man with a gun." Jake followed his gaze. Titan was bleeding from the bullet wound in his hind quarter, but he was still standing, still protecting his family. The bull's dark eyes met Jake's across the pasture, and in that moment, Jake saw something that took his breath away. Forgiveness, understanding, love without conditions or reservations. "He's more than special," Jake said softly. "He's family." Marcus's breathing was getting shallower, more labored. "Jake, in my truck. There's a letter in the glove compartment. For you. Wrote it. Wrote it a long time ago. Before I became this thing." Jake wanted to ask what the letter said, but Marcus's eyes had already gone distant, focusing on something beyond the morning sky. His breathing stopped with a sound like wind through autumn leaves, and then he was gone. Jake sat in the bloody grass beside his oldest friend and greatest enemy, feeling the weight of 55 years of misunderstanding and pain settle around his shoulders like a shroud. The war that had shaped them both, that had sent them home as different men than the boys who had left, had finally claimed its last casualty. Emily was already moving toward Titan, her veterinary instincts taking over. The bull's wound needed attention, and Belle was still weak from blood loss and the trauma of birth. There would be time for grief later, time to process what had happened and what it meant. Right now, there were lives to save. "How bad is he hurt?" Jake asked, pushing himself to his feet with tremendous effort. "The bullet went through muscle, missed the bone," Emily reported after a quick examination. "He'll need stitches, Antibiotics. Probably be limping for a while, but he'll live." Jake felt relief flood through him like cool water. They had all survived. Titan, Belle, the newborn calf, even himself despite the bullet in his shoulder. Marcus was dead. But the family Jake had built from love and loyalty and second chances was intact. The calf was nursing now, wobbling on unsteady legs but strong enough to find her mother's milk. Belle stood patiently, her own injuries forgotten in the simple joy of motherhood, and Titan, despite his wound, maintained his protective stance, watching over both of them with the dedication of a guardian angel. "What will you name her?" Emily asked, nodding toward the calf. Jake considered the question, thinking about the morning that had started with such promise and descended into violence before climbing back toward hope. He thought about Sarah's favorite saying, about second chances and the power of love to transform even the most broken things. "Hope," he said finally. "Her name is Hope." Emily smiled, the first genuine expression of joy she'd shown all morning. "It's perfect," as she worked to clean and bandage Titan's wound. Jake walked slowly to Marcus's truck. The letter was where his old friend had said it would be, yellowed with age. The envelope addressed in handwriting Jake recognized from 1,000 shared duties and borrowed cigarettes. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stood in the morning sunlight, surrounded by the aftermath of violence and the promise of new life, and tried to make sense of it all. Marcus was gone, but the pain that had driven him would die with him. The ranch would continue. The cattle would thrive. And somewhere in the future, Hope would grow up to have calves of her own. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending nonetheless. And sometimes, Jake reflected, an ending was just another word for a beginning. 1 month later, Jake Morrison stood at the fence line watching Hope take her first tentative steps away from her mother's side. The little heifer had grown strong in the weeks since that terrible morning, her coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, her spirit bright with the fearless curiosity of youth. She would venture a few feet from Belle, then scamper back to safety, each small adventure building her confidence for the larger world beyond the pasture. Belle had recovered completely from her injuries, the deep puncture wounds from the python healing into barely visible scars beneath her honey-colored coat. She watched her daughter's explorations with the patient attention of mothers everywhere, ready to intervene if necessary, but wise enough to let Hope learn independence at her own pace. And Titan brave, loyal Titan had exceeded every expectation for his recovery. The bullet wound in his hindquarter had healed clean, leaving him with only a slight limp that seemed to bother Jake more than it bothered the bull himself. If anything, the experience had deepened the bond between the massive animal and the man who had risked everything to protect his family. Jake's own shoulder had healed more slowly, the bullet having nicked bone and torn muscle in ways that reminded him daily of his age. But he was alive. His family was intact. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt something approaching peace. The letter from Marcus lay on the kitchen table behind him, read and reread so many times that the folds were wearing thin. It had been written years ago, Jake realized, probably shortly after Sarah's death, when guilt and grief might have briefly overwhelmed the anger that had consumed his old friend, Jake. It had begun in Marcus's familiar scrawl. "If you're reading this, it means I've done something terrible and can't take it back. The truth is, I killed Sarah, cut her brake lines because I wanted you to feel what I felt when you left me in that jungle. But now she's gone. And I realize I didn't just hurt you. I destroyed the best thing in both our lives. Sarah was always kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it. She was the kind of person the world needed more of. And I took her away because I couldn't let go of something that happened 50 years ago. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that in my better moments, I remember the friend you used to be, and I'm sorry for what I became. Jake had wept when he first read those words, grieving not just for Sarah, but for the man Marcus might have been if he'd chosen healing over hatred. The letter had provided answers, but it had also provided something more precious, the knowledge that somewhere, buried beneath years of bitterness, his old friend had retained enough humanity to feel remorse. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted his thoughts. Jake turned to see a convoy of cars and trucks coming up the ranch road, raising a cloud of dust that caught the late afternoon light like gold. He recognized most of the vehicles. They belonged to neighbors, townspeople, friends who had rallied around him in the weeks since Marcus's death and the revelation of his crimes. The first truck belonged to Tom Bradley, the neighbor who had made that desperate phone call a month ago. Tom climbed out with a cooler in his hands, followed by his wife Martha carrying a covered dish that smelled like her famous apple pie. Behind them came Dr. Chen, her Honda loaded with supplies for what had become a weekly checkup on the growing calf. "How's our little miracle doing today?" Martha called out, setting her pie on the tailgate of Tom's truck and walking toward the pasture fence. "Growing like a weed," Jake replied, his voice carrying the pride of a grandfather. "Emily thinks she'll be as big as her daddy someday." More cars arrived, disgorging families Jake had known for decades but who had only recently become regular visitors to the ranch. Word of Titan's heroism had spread through the community like wildfire, transforming the dangerous bulls that some had once feared into local celebrities. Children pressed against the fence, marveling at Titan's size while their parents shared stories of the dramatic rescue that had become legend. "Look, Daddy!" A little girl named Amy pointed excitedly at Hope. "She's coming over to see us." Indeed, the curious calf had wandered toward the fence, drawn by the crowd of admirers. Hope had no fear of humans. She had been born into a world where people meant help and healing, where the boundaries between species were defined by love rather than mistrust. Jake watched the interaction with deep satisfaction. This was what he had envisioned when he decided to keep the orphaned calves 3 years ago, not just the preservation of 2 lives, but the creation of something larger. A bridge between the human and animal worlds that enriched both sides. Emily Chen approached with her medical bag, but today's visit was more social than professional. "Mind if I take a look at everyone?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. "They'd be disappointed if you didn't," Jake replied. It had become a ritual, these weekly examinations that were really just excuses for Emily to spend time with the cattle she had helped save. She had confided to Jake that working with Titan and Belle had reminded her why she had become a veterinarian in the first place, not for the money or prestige, but for moments like these when medicine merged with miracle. As Emily entered the pasture, Titan approached with his characteristic mixture of wariness and recognition. The bull tolerated the examination but never quite forgot that humans could be dangerous. However, he had learned to trust Emily, to associate her touch with healing rather than harm. "His leg is perfect," Emily announced after checking the site of the old bullet wound. No inflammation, full range of motion. He's as sound as he ever was. Jake felt a familiar surge of gratitude. So much could have gone wrong that morning a month ago. Titan could have been killed. Belle could have died in labor. The calf could have been stillborn. Instead, they had all survived, all found ways to heal, all grown stronger from the ordeal. The community gathering continued as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children played games while their parents shared news and gossip. And everyone took turns admiring the growing calf who had become a symbol of hope for the entire region. Jake found himself in conversation with Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, a thoughtful man in his 70s who had officiated at Sarah's funeral and had been a source of comfort during Jake's darkest days. "You know," the pastor said, watching Titan stand guard over his family, "I've been thinking about what happened here, about love and sacrifice and the price of redemption. That bull of yours demonstrated something most of us struggle with our whole lives." "What's that, Pastor?" "Unconditional love, the willingness to put yourself in harm's way for someone else's welfare, with no expectation of reward or recognition. It's what we talk about in church every Sunday. But it's not often we get to see it lived out so purely." Jake nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Sarah used to say that animals could teach us about God if we paid attention, said they loved without keeping score, forgave without holding grudges. Wise woman, your Sarah. I think she'd be proud of what you've built here, how you've turned tragedy into something beautiful." As if summoned by their conversation, Hope wandered over to where the two men stood, her large brown eyes curious and unafraid. She pushed her nose through the fence slats, seeking attention from these new admirers. Jake reached out to stroke the calf's soft muzzle, marveling at how completely she trusted him. This little creature had no memory of violence or betrayal, no understanding of the hatred that had nearly destroyed her family before she was even born. She knew only love, only protection, only the security of belonging to something larger than herself. "You're going to grow up beautiful and strong," Jake whispered to her. "Just like your mama, just like your daddy. And you're going to know every day of your life that you're loved." As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Jake found himself standing alone with Tom Bradley, watching the last of the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You ever think about what would have happened if Marcus had succeeded?" Tom asked quietly. "If he'd killed them all that morning?" Jake considered the question. "Every day," he admitted. "But then I look at Hope, and I remember that some things are stronger than hate. Some bonds can't be broken by violence or jealousy, or even death." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Marcus chose his path, but you chose yours. Made all the difference." "I had help," Jake said, looking toward where Titan stood silhouetted against the evening sky. "Couldn't have done it alone." As the last visitors departed, and quiet settled over the ranch, Jake made his final rounds of the day. He checked the water troughs, secured the gates, and performed all the small rituals that kept his world running smoothly. But mostly, he just watched his family, the family he had chosen, and that had chosen him in return. Titan and Belle grazed peacefully in the gathering darkness while Hope slept curled between them, safe in the knowledge that she was protected. It was a scene of simple contentment, unmarked by the violence that had threatened to destroy it just weeks earlier. Jake thought about Marcus, buried now in the town cemetery, under a simple headstone that bore only his name and dates of birth and death. No mention of Vietnam, no reference to the bitterness that had consumed his final years. In death, he had been granted the peace that had eluded him in life. Standing there in the Texas twilight, surrounded by the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant call of a whippoorwill, Jake Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: complete contentment. Not happiness exactly, because that seemed too simple a word for what he felt, but a deep satisfaction with the choices he had made and the life he had built. "Home ain't just where you hang your hat," he said aloud, echoing one of Sarah's favorite expressions. "It's where love lives." Behind him, Titan lifted his massive head and made a soft sound that might have been agreement. In the growing darkness, the bull's eyes caught the last light of day, reflecting back something that looked remarkably like peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to demonstrate the values that Sarah had tried to teach him and that Titan had shown him through example. But tonight, all was well. Tonight, love had triumphed over hatred, loyalty over betrayal, hope over despair. And in a small pasture in East Texas, 3 generations of a family bound not by blood but by something deeper settled into sleep under a canopy of stars, secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't written in wedding vows or anniversary cards. They're carved into the hearts of those who choose family over blood, loyalty over convenience, and hope over despair. Jake Morrison's journey reminds us that it's never too late to start over, to find purpose in protecting what matters most, and to discover that family comes in all shapes and sizes. Like so many of us who've weathered life's storms, losing spouses, facing betrayal from old friends, questioning whether our sacrifices meant anything, Jake learned that love multiplies when we give it away. Titan's unwavering devotion to Belle mirrors the kind of commitment we promised at our own altars decades ago, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. And in a world that often feels divided and bitter, this story proves that genuine love, whether between husband and wife, parent and child, or even man and animal, has the power to heal the deepest wounds. As we face our golden years, we're reminded that home truly ain't just where you hang your hat, it's where love lives. The bonds we nurture today become the legacy we leave tomorrow. And every act of protection, every moment of loyalty, every choice to love without conditions creates ripples that extend far beyond our own lives. What bonds in your own life have surprised you with their strength? Have you ever found family in unexpected places? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has transformed your life.